Welcome to the Natural Wisdom Podcast. I'm your host, Kristine Backus. Today is Tuesday, October 29th, 2024. And I want to talk today about kind of what's up in the cosmic forces at work, which primarily relates to the Scorpio new moon on Friday, November 1st, because that's the trigger point and the starting point of a new cycle. We're right now completing the Libra cycle that started back in September. And so I want to talk a little bit about what's going on because it's intense right now, right? I mean, I think probably everybody's feeling it. Some of it is related to we're in the last moments of the US presidential election, which is next Tuesday, November 5th. And even if you're not in the US, I'm guessing that you've at least heard some of it. You may have opinions based on what you've been seeing in the news and what you're tracking. And I want to put some of that in context because I saw a headline um, yesterday, maybe, I can't remember, on one of the mainstream news media, and it said that America is having a panic attack over the US election. And that is um, it's so emblematic of this time and the astrology that we're in the middle of and Scorpio season itself. So let's start unpacking. Actually, before we do that, I want to make one announcement and I'll remind us, I hope if I remember at the end of the podcast too. And that is that I've moved some of my work over to Substack. I still have a website, and we still have the podcast, and the podcast, at least for now, is going to remain hosted on Spotify. You can still find it on my website. But I've moved a lot of my writing and my workshops over to Substack, and most of it's free. A lot of it's free, but paid subscribers get a workshop every month. You get discounts on readings with me, and you can go look that up if you're interested. I'll put the link in the show notes. But I'd invite you to at least follow me there, and you'll hear more about this. The other announcement I want to make is I've been having some trouble getting the video version of the podcast to upload. And so I'm making sure that it's also on YouTube. So I have a YouTube channel, but I've started one specifically for the Natural Wisdom podcast. So if I don't know how it's going to go today, if you're listening to this and you want to watch, that's one of the ways you can do it. You can also watch it on my website. So that's the administrative stuff out of the way and the announcements. So let's dive in to Scorpio and what Scorpio is, what it's about, where we are, right? In tropical astrology, the signs are markers of the seasons. And so when the sun enters Scorpio, we're coming into the middle of autumn, right? The fixed sign, it's a fixed water sign, a yin sign, and the fixed signs come in the heart of the season. And the cross-quarter holidays, holy days, for instance, come when the sun reaches the middle of these fixed signs. So technically, the pagan holy day of Samhain, which morphed into All Hallows Eve, which morphed into Halloween, comes when the sun reaches 15 Scorpio. And that actually doesn't happen in the sky astrotechnically until November 7th, which is next Thursday. Although it tends to get celebrated around the first of the month because, of course, we tend to keep track of things by the calendar in this culture, by the Gregorian calendar. Thus, Halloween, October 31st, All Hallows, November 1st, Day of the Dead. All of those are the same holiday, essentially, as Samhain. And what it means is the dying of the light, right? The dying of the sun. The sun is now coming into its weakest period in the northern hemisphere. It's crossed past the equinox. These cross-quarter holy days are the halfway point between equinox and solstice. So as of next week, we're halfway from the autumn equinox to the December solstice. So we're really in the time when the sun has the least power, the least light, the least warmth. And the closer you are to living in nature, the more that matters to you because the harvest is over, the preparations for winter are pretty well finishing. We're in that sort of in between time in a lot of ways between autumn and winter. Winter doesn't technically start till December, but depending on where you are in the world, you may be feeling it much sooner. We're having an extended autumn here in Montana, so not so much. In fact, there's still lots of color on the trees. In fact, it's been a very brilliant autumn. Lots of bright, bright golds and oranges with all the deciduous trees, particularly along the rivers. But what that means too, again, if you think about, okay, what does that mean for nature is that the trees are dying back. Nature is dying back. And that's what this time of year is all about, is death. And um, in a culture that's terrified of death, which is much of Western culture today, then there's a particular feeling to it, right? This is a time of year when a lot of fear gets triggered. And I even feel it sometimes, that sort of anxiety, knowing that particularly here, it's going to get harder and harder to live for the next few months. It's very hard. It takes a lot more energy and effort to live through a Montana winter than it does to live through a Montana summer. And those of us in the far north of the Northern Hemisphere really have a visceral sense of coming into almost like survival season. And it's an archetypal sense for all of us that live in this part of the world and all of us that come to astrology from a westernized culture, is that whether it's conscious or not, we're coming into a season of death and fear and darkness. And so that colors everything. And interestingly enough, here we have the presidential election in Scorpio season, right in the heart of it. Almost the election days, I don't know how many of them actually fall on the astrotechnical Samhain, but they're close, right? 2 days away next week from Samhain, from this heart of the dark season, heart of Scorpio season. So Scorpio, that's the sort of the seasonal relationship and the relationship to the pagan holiday of Samhain and other meanings of Scorpio. And Scorpio, I mean, it's the Scorpio, right? That's the creature that Scorpio is named after. Other creatures that Scorpio takes its meaning from include the phoenix, right? The bird rising from the ashes of destruction. That's the rebirth and renewal sense of Scorpio. And also the serpent. There's been a sense of the serpent being one of the creatures symbolizing Scorpio. And again, snake can shed its skin. It has to do with wisdom, but not, there's a difference between wisdom and knowledge, right? Knowledge is what you know up here. Wisdom is what you know from a much deeper place. And so Scorpio is a fixed, meaning comes in the heart of the season, meaning that it has the tendency to hold on to things, and a feminine yin sign. So it's more about going inward. It's more about receiving. And it's a water sign. So there's an emotionality to Scorpio. It's the sign of deep feeling. And if you are a Scorpio sun, or you have Scorpio rising or Scorpio moon, or you know somebody with any of those, then you also know that Scorpio does not take things at surface level, right? Scorpio people tend to be the ones that are suspicious. They see what's going on underneath. They don't trust what's on the surface. And they're the ones that are going to dig deep to find out what are the secrets. And they're also the ones that are super good at keeping the secrets, right? Keeping things hidden. Scorpio is a hidden sign. Again, we're in a darker time of the year. Things are not coming to light as easily. So that's where we are in terms of the season. And so here we are 2 days from a new moon, and we have some of the most, I hate to use the word intense, maybe the most triggering astrology of the year is one way to think about it. We've had some big alignments this year. Most of them have been pretty short-lived, and some of these alignments are very short-lived too. As I talk about them, you'll know why. One of the larger alignments we had this year was the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in April 20th. That was one of those that doesn't come very often. I think it's a 14-year cycle, and it tends to mean big new changes. And we may or may not really know what those are yet. But what we've got going on now involves, we have actually three separate oppositions, planets facing off across the sky at this new moon. And whenever we're talking about oppositions, as I think we talked about in the last episode, we're talking about, well, if you think about the two ends of a seesaw, that there's almost like well, there's a lot of projection. I'm taking my stuff and putting it onto you. There's a lot of potential for conflict, particularly when we get caught up in the more simplistic view of separating me and you into two others, two opposites, right? Where when even if we use the analogy of the seesaw, there's one piece of whatever that connects the two. They're not actually separate, they're connected. If you're on a seesaw with somebody else, you're very much connected to that other being, that other person. And that's the truth of oppositions that often gets lost with oppositions. And that's why the projections are so destructive, is that they come from a sense of you're different than me, you're separate from me. So the three oppositions that we have going in this new moon. So we have the conjunction of the sun and the moon, right? The sun and the moon are coming together at the same degree of the zodiac in the sky. It's why we can't see the moon. The moon, if it hasn't gone dark already, it'll be going dark tonight or tomorrow. So we're into that dark time. So it's a dark time of year and then a dark time of month. And so the sun and the moon are coming together, initiating a new cycle. But we have three separate oppositions at this new moon. And the most explosive, the most powerful, and the longest lived is the Mars-Pluto opposition. It's actually been in effect for days now, maybe even longer than that, because Mars is slowing down, getting ready to move backwards in the sky from our point of view, beginning in early December. So Mars is slowing down. Pluto moves extremely slowly, and in fact, it's moving even slower than usual because it just turned direct a couple of weeks ago. And so we have Mars in this opposition with Pluto. Mars, passion, action, assertiveness, potential aggression, potential violence. Pluto, the dark forces from the underworld, right? It's god of the underworld, what's hidden, what's repressed, the power that we repress, that unless we allow it to flow, becomes dangerous. And with our very negative cultural view of power, then power in our culture becomes control, and it becomes dangerous, and it becomes power over somebody else because we've lost the sense that power is a creative force. And that's why both Pluto and Mars have so much negative connotations. That's why people get afraid of Pluto transits. Yes, they can be uncomfortable, having been there, done that for 13 years now because of all my Capricorn planets. So yes, they can be uncomfortable, but they have a purpose. Pluto has a purpose. And because of our distortions around power and our distortions around darkness and our distortions around death and all of the scorpionic themes, We've made the Mars-Pluto oppositions more dangerous than they need to be. And that's one of the primary things I wanted to talk about. And in fact, if you become a paid member of the Substack community, then you can see the whole workshop I did on this last Friday, where we actually looked at the US chart and the chart of the candidates, which I won't really have time to go into today, but I'll touch on. So anyway, that's another little short commercial for joining me there. But what I wanted to say again is that because we have such distorted view, we have a distorted view of masculinity. And we have a distorted view of Mars energy, of animation. We have a distorted view of desire and passion. And then that distorted view of what power really is. And so this Mars-Pluto opposition becomes more dangerous, more explosive. And it's more up to you and me as individuals to own our Mars-Pluto energies and integrate them in a more conscious way, because what we do as individuals, of course, affects the collective. It doesn't take very many of us to be conscious of our desires and conscious of our passions and conscious of how we're in tension with our power, our ability to create, our that life force that both Mars and Pluto represent, but from kind of different levels. Mars is the life force that comes from the will and the more conscious will. And Pluto is the life force and the power that comes from a more unconscious, more soul level place. And when we bring them into consciousness and use them in constructive, creative ways to co-create life, then we can help lessen some of the danger, if you will, of the Mars, Pluto, and the collective. And it does matter, right? This is one of the things we tend to think we don't matter as individuals. But anyway, that's a whole, it's a soapbox for another day. So Mars, Pluto, and what makes this particular face-off so powerful is that you have Mars and Pluto both at the very last degrees of their signs. And as I said in the last episode, the 29th degree of Capricorn is called the dictator degree. So that's where Pluto is. And we're seeing it, right? We're seeing wild accusations from both candidates, really, in the presidential election about the end of democracy as we know it. If you listen to Trump, Kamala's going to start a nuclear war. If you listen to Harris, Trump is going to take away all civil liberties and become a dictator. And so they're both projecting that dictator energy on each other. And they can't both, well, maybe they can both be right. They probably can both be right. But I think what's more useful is to recognize that in the zeal to take control, there is this incredible intensity of projection. And it's nothing new. It's more intense, I think, in this cycle, but it's nothing new. And I don't think it's unique to the US, although I'm not as familiar with elections and politics in other countries, but this tear down the other in order to get the upper hand, it's part of what's put us in the position where we are today, where there's so little trust in government, so little trust in politicians, because you can't spend years telling us how awful the other guy is from both sides without some of that starting to sink in, and it just becomes a universal, yeah, they're all awful. And yeah, right. Again, that's a bit of a digression, but that's part of what's going on with this Mars-Pluto opposition. So another opposition in the sky that's I find very interesting is Uranus at the tail end. So again, the later degrees, the last degrees of Uranus. Because if you remember, backing up for a moment, big picture, all three of the outer planets are getting ready to change signs. And in fact, all three of them, plus Saturn, will be in new signs next summer. At the Virgo new moon is the most dramatic chart to my eyes, because everything's at 1 degree of a new sign. Some of the planets will back up a little bit, but this is an epic, crazy, unusual several thousand year cycle that's happening right now where all three of these planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, all of the transpersonal, the social planets, the outer planets that have to do with our kind of collective backdrop, collective energetic backdrop are shifting. But right now, all three of them are at the end of their signs. And when you get to the last few degrees of a sign, there's a sense of urgency, which is part of what we're all feeling, right? This sense of urgency that, oh my gosh, things are going to change. I need to do something. I don't know what's going to happen. Everything's going to be different. And it's a feeling of being out of control on top of Scorpio season, which has a flavor. Shadow Scorpio wants to be in control, whereas conscious Scorpio is letting go of control and allowing the full intense experience of life, right? Living on the edge. Scorpio is the edge walker. So we have this intense grasping at control in these last few degrees of with the outer planets at the last few degrees. And actually we have, I think there's 6 planets at the last degrees of the signs, including Mercury, as well as Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, and then so I want to say Venus, is that right? No, I can't remember. I have to go look at the chart. But we have a whole bunch of planets at the very last degrees of their signs right now. So Mars, right? Mars at 29 Cancer. So we have that sense of urgency and everything coming to a head and a conclusion. It's like everything coming into those final moments before something dies in order to have something reborn. That's the feeling around this Scorpio new moon. So, um, so Mars, Pluto, and then the second, Mercury, Uranus. This is very interesting. Uranus and Taurus, Mercury at the late degrees of Scorpio, at the new moon. So Mercury, Uranus, these planets, like Mars and Pluto, are considered like octaves of each other. Pluto is considered the quote unquote higher octave of Mars. So it's almost like Pluto's the transpersonal version of Mars, right? Both related to desire, both related to like the life force energy. Then you get Mercury and Uranus in an opposition. Mercury is our perception, how we think about things, how we speak about things. Mercury in Scorpio might have to do with hidden knowledge, hidden language, hidden meaning in things. And whereas because Scorpio's hidden, right? Hidden words, hidden language. And then Uranus and Taurus is a very material oriented place. It's Uranus and Taurus has been stirring up our relationships with our bodies, our relationship with the earth, our relationship with the material world, the earth itself, and also finance and money. And so there could be secrets coming to light around financial stuff, secrets coming to light around money, secrets coming to light or hidden knowledge or repressed knowledge. It's another Scorpio thing is repression around body issues. Maybe, yeah, I'm not going to speculate because it gets so divisive so quickly to talk about some of the Uranus and Taurus themes. But again, it's that tension between information, perception, what I see maybe on a more mundane level with Mercury versus Uranus, the Great Awakener, revelations. There's also a revolutionary aspect to Uranus. So maybe this is revolutionary words. And certainly that's what we're seeing again in the campaign is a lot of this projection of, well, if this side loses, the other side is going to create a revolution. And it's not just one side. Depending on which media you're listening to, you may think it's one side, but if you dig a little bit deeper, and get beyond just the mainstream, you'll find that both sides are sort of bracing for revolution in a ways. It's very interesting, a little scary, but very interesting. And again, the fear is programming. There's a lot of fear programming going on right now, and I have a whole story about that, but I'll leave that aside. But I think it's without it's hard to doubt that we're getting dosed with fear. Right? There's a lot of fear mongering and fear porn, and it just right now happens to be centered on the election. But it could be the wars. It could be another virus. I mean, there's lots of ways for the fear program to get intensified and played out. Okay, so that's the second one. Mercury, language, voice, perception. Uranus, breakthroughs, breakdowns, revelations, all revolutions, all of those things in tension with each other. And then the third is Venus and Jupiter. So this would typically be seen as Venus and Jupiter are the two benefics, the two good guys or good gals of the planetary pantheon. And of course, that's a very simplistic way of looking at them because every planet can be consciously or unconsciously expressed, and we carry all of those energies within us, and how we use them is up to us. So Venus and Jupiter, I'm still unpacking this one, but this is Venus, the planet of obviously the feminine, but the planet of our values, what we attract, what we magnetize, a planet of relationship, planet of harmony. It can relate to women specifically. It doesn't have to, but it can. And it's in Sagittarius. Sagittarius is, it's like Venus is the wild woman here. Venus is uh, Sagittarius is the centaur, right? Very instinctive, very much connected to nature. So this is the wild child, the nature child with Venus and Sagittarius. And also there's a sense of wanting freedom, right? The room to roam, the freedom. There's a sense of truth, right? Sagittarius also has truth, although the shadowy part of it becomes dogma. So there's a potential with Venus in Sagittarius for a dogmatic view of the feminine, or a dogmatic view of those kinds of things. Whereas with Jupiter and Gemini, just having turned retrograde, it's Jupiter is in its fall, doesn't necessarily like to be in Gemini because Jupiter likes to go big. Sagittarius is big. Jupiter likes to get the big story, the big meaning. And in Gemini, there's that multiplicity of views. There's the multiple facts, multiple information. And so there's some kind of tension here between um, there's some kind of tension here around finding the truth and the freedom to explore ideas. There's some kind of, and of course, we've been seeing that for years now, a lot of tension between, um, a lot of tension around people wanting a solid, certain truth, and yet there being so many viewpoints out there about almost any topic you can imagine. Is the Earth round? Was COVID real? Were the vaccines a good idea or a bad idea? Did they kill people or save people or both? All of those things are part and parcel of what's been going on in the last few years. And so we may see more tension around stories versus facts. And again, with Mercury Uranus opposition, maybe we see more revelations and more, just more, yeah, more revelations around what's the truth, or more revolution around what's the truth. And the Venus Jupiter, another meaning of Venus and Jupiter in opposition could be too much of a good thing. Maybe we'll see more bold statements, more risk taking in terms of how we relate to each other. So all of those are the three oppositions in effect at this new moon. So again, a lot of tension And the more we other, the more we decide that you are different than me and like a completely separate species or a completely separate being or a completely separate country, a different tribe, right? Tribalism with Mars and the end of Cancer, this intense tribalism is part of it. So if the more that each of us sees somebody else as from a completely different tribe and no longer connected, no longer part of the same humanity, then the more dangerous these oppositions are. So for working through the fear, for working through the fear at this time, it's I think it's imperative to remember that it's programming, right? That there's so whatever you're feeding yourself from what's online is you're having to digest it, and then you're taking on some of it. And if you have, I like to think of this as the Velcro hooks and loops. Right? If you have some loops, some fear loops inside you, and who among us doesn't, right? If we've had any kind of traumatizing experiences, we may very well still have like these little hooks for fear. So as the fear gets programmed and spewed out and sent to you, a lot of it through these computers, a lot of it through the media, both traditional and non-traditional. If your little hooks may grab onto, or your little loops may get grabbed onto, hooked onto by the fear coming at you. And if you can remember that so much of it is, it's almost like a fear matrix. I actually saw this once in a meditation that there's a fear matrix. For some of us, it's around money and finances. For others, it's around control of our bodies. For others, it's around confinement and loss of freedoms, freedom of speech. Those of us that carry any kind of a witch wound are getting really stirred up, particularly in Scorpio season right now, right? So if you can remember that the Matrix isn't real, right? Go back and watch the movie if that helps. If you can remember that it's not real and come back into your personal physical experience, also helps to do a media fast. Get off of all the media platforms because they're all just like, I don't know, at least in my feeds, and maybe that's because I've followed a few too many of the wrong people, so it's all politics all the time. Although even the places, even what I consider mainstream platforms, Facebook and Instagram, are always trying to talk to me about voting, and I don't personally, I don't think it's any of their damn business whether I'm going to, what I'm going to do. But so all of them are sort of geared, at least in the States, geared to kind of ratchet up the noise and ratchet up the intensity. So media fast, coming back to your physical experience, taking a few breaths, and and especially with this Mars Pluto opposition and even the Mercury Uranus, right? That's a stirring up of the nervous system. There's a lot of stirring up of the nervous system. It's so important to not react right now. I've talked about notice where you're putting your attention. See if you can, like, if you do want to look at the news, see if you can step back a moment and look at it more as an archaeologist or an anthropologist. Notice, what are they curating for me? No matter what news source you like, no matter whether it's mainstream or otherwise, the news is being curated on that site. Even the most seemingly and intentionally objective site is still choosing what to show you. So if you can remember that and maybe see it more as experimental, I went out to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, kind of are my mainstream go-tos for what are they telling me today. And then Apple News is horrible, but that's an interesting one to go as a anthropologist. What are they showing me today? Well, New York Times is at least above the fold, thinking about it from an electronic standpoint. It's all election all the time, all anti-Trump, all pro-Harris. There's not even a modicum of trying to have balance and look at bigger topics. And then I think there were two stories about the war in the Middle East, And then the very next thing was the 10 best pizza places in New York. That's the New York Times. All election, all the time. I think they've endorsed a candidate, so it's not surprising that that the election coverage is pretty one way. Um, but it was interesting, right? Because that's the news. That's all they think of is the news, is what I just gave you. The Wall Street Journal, definitely lots of election coverage. I don't know that they've endorsed a candidate. Maybe some of you do. I don't know that they have. They seem to be more skewed towards Trump, but there's also, I'd say that's not a fully, I'd say that's not 100%. There's a little bit of each. And then lots of stuff about the war. Of course, because it's the Wall Street Journal, more financial news, and then all sorts of interesting things. Random, I'd say a lot of random things. So less focused on one thing. I didn't go look at Apple News today. But at any rate, if you can take that perspective to kind of, instead of getting sucked into the content, even just notice, well, what are they showing me? And this is true with Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or X. All of them, if you can at least just back up for a moment, that will help through some of this fear mongering. And again, news fast right now, it could be very useful. Whether you're in the States or somewhere else, that could be very useful. And then what else? There was one more thing I wanted to say. Well, and then the other thing was to say, really working hard right now to not react, because one of the problems with the fact that we're so connected electronically through these, you have to remember that the computer and the phone are an intermediary between you and whoever it is you're interacting with, whether it's a presidential candidate through watching the news or watching them on a podcast or whatever it is. There's still something in between you. It's not face to face for real. So especially with the online stuff, it's so easy to impulsively Mars react. And then Mercury Uranus, maybe again, even that has a very speedy, sped up, like words blurting out of our mouths kind of feeling to it. So the other thing I'd say about surviving this time with some kind of sense of integrity intact is to come back to ourselves, what's really true for ourselves, notice our emotions, allow the emotions, but then try not to react, try not to instantaneously respond to a comment or make a comment. And I mean, I have a personal hope that we will return to civil discourse someday in our political world. We will stop seeing each other as evil. We will stop seeing that, stop with the two sides, and that separation and tribalism that we've got that is so destructive to us as a country and certainly to us as a world. And so I have this hope. And of course, from an energetic point of view, and again, what I was talking about at the very beginning, what we do as individuals matters. Because as Carl Jung said so eloquently, it's the changes and the transformations within the individuals that become the changes and the transformations in the collective. So if I can find peace within and stop hating and stop fearing the other guy, and in fact, stop seeing the other guy as the other guy and seeing them as more me than not me, more connected than not connected, then we can maybe come to a place. Well, we'll talk more in future episodes, and I've talked about them in past episodes when I've talked about Saturn. We can come to our new golden age because we're ripe for that, right? We're in a big dying. We're in a big death, not just in the US, but in the world with this big transition that we're in the midst of right now. We're coming to the end of an era, the end of an epoch. We know that I know that from all the overlapping cycles that are coming to an end, whether it's the Mayan calendar or the age of Pisces, coming into the age of Aquarius or the Kali Yuga, we're coming into a big ending. And so we're feeling that sense of doom and death because, especially if we're in a culture that doesn't honor death as part of the cycle, right? And that's what this time of year is about, coming back to the very beginning, talking about Scorpio season. This is a time to honor the cycle of death and rebirth and to understand that death is not an ending, whether it's the death of an empire, such as the United States, which I talked about in one of my Substack posts that you can go read, whether it's the death of whatever it's the death of it. Here, it's the death of the season of fertility. It's the death of summer. It's the death of the light. But there will be a rebirth. If nature taught us nothing else, even if you didn't look at astrology and the cycles of the planets, you can see the cycles of the sun and moon. And we're in the dying of the Libra cycle right now with the balsamic moon. And we'll have the rebirth of the Scorpio cycle with the new moon on Friday. We're in the dying of the sun's light, and then we'll be in the rebirth of the sun's light beginning December. So I'm going to leave you with that, that if we can, yeah, I'm just going to leave you with that. The sense of death is a prelude to rebirth, whether it's in politics or nations or our own lives, or nature itself. And we're in that season. I wish you all the best getting through the dark, this short-term dark season, and then of course the long-term dark season, which we'll be talking more about in future episodes. And don't forget that I've written some things about this on Substack. I've talked about it. There are a couple of free workshops there, free episodes. And there will be more on both sides of the paywall as things go along. So I hope you join me there. And thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for joining me here. And I'll see you again in a few weeks.